Hello everyone, my name is Jonathan Thornton. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Liverpool. In this presentation I'm going to look at Leena KROHN'S, Tainaron and Johanna SINISALO'S Not Before Sundown in the context of both the New Weird and the Finnish Weird. To do so, I'm first going to outline the New Weird and Finnish Weird as conceptual approaches to writing and reading speculative fiction. Then I'm going to explore how KROHN and SINISALO'S texts can be read as both New Weird and Finnish Weird. Then I'll conclude drawing together ideas across these two texts. The New Weird has retained critical traction for talking about a series of texts with overlapping concerns, even as it has continued to be difficult to define. Anne and Jeff VanderMeer provide a useful working definition of the genre in their anthology The New Weird, describing it as a type of urban secondary world fiction that subverts the romanticized ideas about place found in traditional fantasy, largely by choosing realistic, complex, real-world models as the jumping-off point for creation of settings that may combine elements of both science fiction and fantasy. They go on to note that the New Weird uses elements of surreal or transgressive horror, and that it is acutely aware of the modern world, if not always political. They frame the awareness of the modern world in terms of involving the use of postmodern techniques that do not undermine the surface reality of the text. In their anthology, the VanderMeers sets out consciously to make the case for the New Weird as a valid genre, splitting the book into stimuli, older stories that they view as formative to the genre but not necessarily a part of it, and evidence, the title implying the stories are being put forward to make a case for the New Weird. The only working translation in either section, and in the VanderMeers list of recommended reading at the end of the book, is an excerpt from Leena KROHN'S Tainaron, Mail from Another City, published in Finnish in 1984 but not translated to English until 2004. Leena KROHN'S writing has also been conceptualized as the Finnish Weird, a term coined by Finnish speculative fiction writer Johanna to describe the work of herself and her peers. Jussi K describes the Finnish Weird as Finnish Weird is a large overall genre, an umbrella term that encompasses all diagonal, that is to say, non-realistic approaches to any story we can't label as science fiction or fantasy without being unjust to both the author and the readers. There might be, and usually are, quite a lot of realistic ingredients in the story, but something odd happens all of a sudden that sheds a diagonal light on that reality, and this is where the weird steps in. If both the VanderMeers and SINISALO appear conscious of the advantages of an identifiable brand for selling challenging speculative fiction, the critical longevity of both terms suggests they have use beyond marketing categories. We are all likely aware of the legacy of the New Weird, thanks to works like China Miéville's Perdido Street Station and Jeff VanderMeer's Southern Reach trilogy. Finnish Weird has been enthusiastically adopted by the Helsinki Science Fiction Society, who published 4 issues of Finnish Weird from 2014 to 2017 in the run-up to the 2017 Worldcon at Helsinki, collecting essays and short stories to further solidify the genre. Both KROHN'S Tainaron and SINISALO'S debut, Finlandian Tiptree prize-winning novel Not Before Sundown, have been conceptualized as both New Weird and the Finnish Weird. However, there are important distinctions between the New Weird and the Finnish Weird. If the New Weird comes from writers like VanderMeer and Miéville's dissatisfactions with the limits of fantasy and science fiction as genres, Hanna Samola and Hanna-Riikka Roine argue that the Finnish Weird is born out of a frustration with the dominance of realist fiction in Finnish literature. While the writers of New Weird have been outspoken in their goal to subvert the romanticized ideas about place found in traditional fantasy, in the context of the Finnish Weird, the subversive features are designed to challenge the tradition of realist writing that has dominated the Finnish literary canon for a long time. This has led to important distinctions in how the New Weird and the Finnish Weird approach the fantastical and realist elements of their text. Each genre offers a different lens on the two texts, which in turn allow us to reflect on the strengths and the limits of the genres. In keeping with VanderMeer's conception of the New Weird as being urban secondary world fiction that subverts the romanticized ideas about place found in traditional fantasy, Leena KROHN'S Tainaron follows a human visitor to the city of Tainaron, which is inhabited by insect people. In this situation, the unnamed narrator is the outsider who must adopt to the customs of the city and its insect inhabitants. Minna German notes that KROHN has said that she chose insects as the characters because they are as alien to humans as possible. We often look at other people with as little familiarity as we would have for grasshoppers and mosquitoes. It is this sense of alienation that is reflected back onto the human narrator. There are immediately apparent similarities between Tainaron and New Krobazon, the sprawling metropolis of Mieville's new weird text Perdido Street Station, which is also full of bizarre and fantastical creatures in a celebration of hybridity, including the insect-like Tiptree. However, where Mieville's Perdido Street Station, like much traditional fantasy, is narrated in multi-viewpoint close third person, and New Krobazon is mapped out for the reader in glorious grotesque detail, right down to the traditional fantasy map at the start of the book, Tainaron is rendered decidedly unmappable. We only experience the city through the protagonist's letters home, and neither the protagonist nor the receiver of her letters are ever named or pinned down. Thus, our view of Tainaron is always through a highly subjective perspective that is forever unknown to the reader. This is fitting, as one of the key themes of the book is the illusion of continuity of self. Is a person or a city the same thing that they were in the past? In the 22nd letter, the narrator tries to find a cake shop they had walked by on a previous occasion, and unable to locate it asks Longhorn, her guide, for a map of the city. Longhorn explains that there are no maps of Tainaron, because the city changes so quickly any attempt to map it would immediately be rendered obsolete. A map cannot be made, he continued, because Tainaron is constantly changing. All cities change, I said. None as fast as Tainaron, Longhorn replied. For what Tainaron was yesterday, it is no longer today. No one can have a grasp on Tainaron as a whole. Every map would lead its user astray. Tainaron is not a place, as you perhaps think. It is an event which no one measures. It is no use anyone trying to make maps. It would be a waste of time and effort. There is no familiar map of the city in the opening of Tainaron, because the very nature of the city precludes such a map being made. The mutability of Tainaron is echoed in its citizens. Every winter they hibernate in pupal form and emerge as different people. Matthew Cheney argues that this mutability is reflected in the novel's fractured narrative. Tainaron the book cannot be mapped any more than Tainaron the city could be, because with each reading it changes, and with each reader. It is not a single story, but rather a conglomeration of stories whose borders blend into each other, whose words echo other words, until the book becomes a harmony in the reader's mind, a suggestion of even more stories than the ones told on the page. In its refusal to be mappable, both the city and the novel Tainaron open up a different narrative space than allowed for by conventional fantasy. Johanna's SINISALO'S Not Before Sundown does not take place in a secondary world, but in the modern-day city of Tampere in the west of Finland. The weird encroaches on the narrative when Angel, a young gay photographer, finds a troll cub and brings it to his flat to nurse it back to health. The novel is aligned with the new weird and other explorations of the urban uncanny by its focus on outsider characters, gays, artists, and mail-order brides, who experience a different city to the mainstream society that excludes them, one overlaid and marked by signals interpretable only to themselves, as Eke, the young man who works at the local gay bar, describes. Odd how there can be cities and cities, cities within cities. The dog city is built up of smells. For dogs, the limits of a city block are drawn by different aromas of piss, and each smells like a cloth fluttering in the wind, or a block-long cartoon balloon. Fido was here about a day and night ago, or it shouts out loud. The youngest male human just went by here with smoked ham in his bag. The air is thick with these signals, but the dog reads them as fluently and extemporaneously as a human processing the cacophony of photons from all the colors and shifts and shapes of light. The atmosphere in the Café Bongo is perpetually crisscrossed by so many silent messages that, were they visible, the whole dive would be rainbow-colored spiders' webs from floor to ceiling, red strands of lust, blue longings, waitings and hopings, tingling yellow signals that it's time to take the first step, permissions being covertly asked and covertly granted, and naturally, there has also to be some coal-black thread of contempt and disappointment and outright hatred. The city becomes defamiliarized depending on one's perspective of it, and just as Tainaron is unmappable because it is constantly changing, the reader may ask if mapping Tampere is equally futile simply because every subjective person experiences their own personal version of the city. However, SINISALO'S metafictional techniques extend the novel's subversion of experienced reality beyond that which the new weird is normally comfortable with. The outsider's city becomes metaphorically linked with the mythological city through the figure of the troll. Hanna Samala and Hanna Royne argue that the contrast between the modern story and its mythical, dark fairy tale underpinnings is one of the foundations for the novel, and this is realized both at the level of events and characters and in the structure of the work. This can be seen in how the novel's narrative is split between first-person passages and articles from novels, poems, academic works, and websites that provide context about trolls and their significance in Finnish mythology. Merja Lepärati points out that many of these documents are real or could be real, but the facts about trolls are mostly additions by the author. These metafictional elements blur the boundaries between fact and fiction by connecting SINISALO'S fantastical elements of her story to the real world outside the text and vice versa. Similarly, the nature of SINISALO'S trolls remains ambiguous. While they are described in scientific terms, with trolls being discovered as a species in 1907, the narrative and the intertextual elements all highlight the supernatural demonic aspects of trolls. The found documents reflect on and amplify certain elements of the text, allowing what is portrayed initially as realist and metaphor, such as Eke's description of the outsider's city, as literal and fantastical, as can be seen in this document that immediately follows Eke's chapter. Bart and Wilman, The Black and Invisible, a fantasy romance, 1985. It is said, it was a wise man from the far north who told me, it is said that in certain parts of Scandinavia, there are cities within cities, just as though there are circles within circles, existent yet invisible, and those cities are inhabited by creatures more terrible than the imagination can create, man-shapes but man-devouring, as black and silent as the night they prowl in. Thus, the metaphorical secret city of the ostracized gay community and its secret lines of code and communication becomes aligned with the fantastical city of trolls hidden within the human city. The new weird and the Finnish weird share many similar approaches and concerns, which allow us to conceptualize works like Johanna SINISALO'S Not Before Sundown and Leena Tainaron as belonging to both genres. Both Tainaron and Not Before Sundown are urban fantasies that subvert the romanticized ideas about place found in traditional fantasy and use the fantastic to reflect the political sense of the modern world and engage with postmodern techniques, whether Tainaron's epistolatory format or the fictionalized found text inserted into Not Before Sundown's narrative. However, both novels use these techniques to subvert genre conventions to a greater extent than found in works like Mieville's Perdido Street Station, resulting in texts that refuse to be mapped to genre contrivances that the new weird still embraces. Both novels show how weird traditions from outside the Anglophone world can enrich and complicate our Anglo-centric conceptions of genre. Thank you for listening to my talk. Here are my references.